Welcome to Daniel Morgan Graduate School. I'm Frank Fletcher, Director of Lectures and Seminars, and your host for today's roundtable discussion on the geopolitics of energy, moderated by Paul Michael Wiebe, Senior Research Fellow at Daniel Morgan Graduate School. Also presenting today will be Colonel Preston McLaughlin, Professor of National Security at Daniel Morgan Graduate School, Brigadier General Tom Cosentino, Chief Operating Officer of Business Executives for National Security, Rula Manasra, President and CEO of Lynx Intelligence, Dr. Arnie Dupuy with Booz Allen Hamilton, and Mr. Adam Seitz, Senior Research Associate on the Middle East with Marine Corps University in Quantico, Virginia. And providing context before we begin today's discussion is DMGS Professor of National Security, Colonel Preston McLaughlin.
Thank you, Frank. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome today. This is the fourth in a series of panels we've held here on national security and the geopolitics of energy. As part of the national security program, we have a lesson in the very first class all students take here that focuses on national security policy and energy, how they are often intertwined as vital interests to the state. And what we've noticed in the last series of panels is that in the United States, the North American bloc is achieving more energy independence with liquid natural gas and with fracking going on with the industry. So our national security policy is not as much dictated by energy policy that is external to the North American bloc. So this provides a lot of opportunities and also a lot of risk. So one of the things we're going to do today is talk about some current issues in regards to national security policy and the geopolitics of energy.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you, Colonel McLaughlin. Moving now to our DMGS Geopolitics of Energy newsbreaker. Item 1, May 17, 2018. President Trump declares that natural gas is to be part of reforming the NATO alliance at the July summit meeting between the United States and its European alliance members. Within that context, I want to pose the first question to you, Tom. The question is, the transatlantic alliance is dealing with serious and divisive issues, including the Iran nuclear deal, U.S.-EU trade negotiations, and strong populist-based governments and movements. Why is the president now injecting the issue of natural gas and Russia's gas exports into the agenda of the upcoming NATO summit, given these geopolitical tensions?
So what I would say, Paul, is the first thing to remember is that NATO was founded as a collective defense organization with shared national interests that were based on security. The president, his strategy is very much in that same vein. It's a realist strategy with the fundamental belief that nation states' national interests need to drive a healthy alliance. If all the interests of the states are not being satisfied, or at least the primary interest of each state, then the alliance will be weak. The president looks at energy security as the new area of coercion that the Russians used. In the past, it was military coercion on their European neighbors. Now it's energy coercion. And he's gone to the issue of where the United States, with mutual interest, is able to best relieve that stress and coercion through the export and the guaranteed supply of LNG to the NATO countries. President also looks at what are U.S. interests in this? So it's a strong alliance of mutually committed partners, and also one that brings a return back to the U.S. And the return in this case is an improved trade balance through the sale of fracked natural gas or LNG to our allies. The president looks at who have been the allies who have supported us the best in Afghanistan and in other crises, and he sees that they're the ones at most risk and most pressure from the Russians because of energy. And he's developed a policy that he believes will both enhance the security of Europe through energy security, strengthen the alliance through mutual interests, reduce U.S. trade imbalance, and position the U.S. In its traditional role as leader of the NATO alliance.
Thank you, Tom. Rula, here's a question for you. Qatar is the largest LNG supplier to Europe, providing 6% of total natural gas imports to the continent. What would be the adverse consequences to Qatar if the U.S. does indeed ramp up its LNG exports to Europe? And if none are anticipated, why not?
Thank you for the question. I think one of the primary challenges for Qatar will be maintaining its market share in Europe. However, Qatar is seen as not just the top LNG producer, but also the most reliable LNG producer. And it will view this competition in the market very pragmatically, just as all the energy producers would. One project that they have underway is increasing their domestic production from 77 million tons to 100 million tons per annum to better supply rising energy demand globally. They're also looking to partner with some of the oil majors globally to be able to have more of a geostrategic advantage in order to supply areas such as Europe. And, the reality is it's going to be a better supplied world. However, the issue of reliability is going to be very important, and Qatar has never defaulted on a shipment, so I think they have that advantage, particularly as many of these countries in Europe are looking to diversify their portfolio as consumers because of the energy security issues on the continent. So having that diversification, will be an advantage for them as they go down the line and some of the geopolitics start to shift. And lastly, the Qataris, from a cost perspective, always have the advantage of being able to supply the world at a lower cost than many of the other U.S. producers.
Supplemental question, Roland. Thank you for that. You mentioned strategic advantage in terms of geostrategic advantage in terms of Qatar's calculations. How important is market share to Qatar of the Chinese and Indian LNG markets?
Incredibly important, considering that those two countries that you just named are projected to have the highest demand growth and population growth in the next decade, if not even further. This is going to be a very important market and one that's going to be highly competitive. But Qatar has secured long-term contracts with these countries and is well positioned to be able to supply their energy future needs.
Thank you. Adam, the United Arab Emirates has just occupied the key island of Socotra at the mouth of the Gulf of Aden, choke point which leads into the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. Given the adversarial nature of current UAE Qatari relations, does this now mean that the Emirati military has a capability to disrupt or block Qatari shipments of natural gas to its customers in Europe?
Thank you for the question. Thank you for the invitation today. I would say start off by saying Socotra has been kind of rumored or thought of as this military basing or foreign design area by a number of actors. The UAE is just one, and this goes back for a long time. But it's never come to really fruition for any of these actors. I would say that the UAE, this is part of a broader strategy by the UAE, part of the military campaign in Yemen, but also part of a broader strategy in terms of its port basing and directing, either directing business back to its own port or stifling competition in the region. Socotra, though, is just a small piece of this. And in terms of Qatar, I think that would represent a huge escalation in terms of using this island in that type of way, or any of these ports in that type of way. I think that in terms of the Qatari, blocking Qatari exports to Europe. In my opinion, again, this is just part of a larger strategy by the UAE to monopolize some of the market. There's larger competition in this area. Socotra is also, they've lost some of their basing in Somalia and some of their and are looking to other areas. But this is another port, like you have Mocha in Yemen, they control Aden and Makalla, who the UAE largely controls through its partnership with local actors. But I would say that, again, in terms of blocking Qatari shipments, do they have the capabilities? Potentially, yes. Would they really consider that at this point? I wouldn't say that that's a bridge too far at this point. So really, that this is a part of, again, that broader strategy for strategic depth and also an economic strategy for the UAE in that part of the world. So yes, thank you.
Supplemental question, Adam. To what extent could this island be transformed into a floating aircraft carrier in order for the UAE or its allies like Saudi to conduct air missions against Houthi rebels in Yemen?
Of course, it is a potential. It is, and there is a airfield there. That is what's being, when we have storms like what is going on, the tsunami in Socotra now, are taking place there recently. That is the only way in or out of Socotra. It's navigable by sea. So yes, there is an airstrip there and could be a potential area for basing. We're noticing competition in the Horn of Africa between the Gulf states and Turkey, Russia, and others for military basing and partnerships, and also just access ports for economic reasons. So Socotra is pretty much a diversification for them and could be used, yes, for those types of operations.
And if that were to be the case, how would that disrupt tanker traffic into the Red Sea and Suez Canal?
Attacks from Socotra on
That region, if it turns into a war zone.
I think the threat. I don't think the threat would increase in terms to the shipping based on what's going on in Socotra or the basing of forces in Socotra. I think that would be, at this point, have a limited mission for the UAE. That doesn't have, in terms of expanding it, there was designs by, of course, the Soviets and others back in the day, and they really didn't come to fruition because of geography and other things that limit the use of that island as well. So,
Thank you. Arnie, question for you. Current market conditions and limited LNG export capacity in the United States makes it difficult for this country to provide significant supply to either Europe or its NATO members within the immediate future. Will this change in any way because of decisions that might be taken at the July NATO summit, or because of large U.S. LNG export capacities coming online over the next couple of years?
Thanks, Paul Michael. Appreciate the invitation and the question. I'd like to emphasize that there's no such thing as a uniquely dedicated NATO energy infrastructure or DoD energy infrastructure. They're very closely interrelated with the civilian infrastructure. So that said, these NATO allied partners, their partners, allies in NATO and so on, are highly dependent upon natural gas for their infrastructures, which by extension indicates that the U.S. forces in the area are also dependent on this infrastructure. So with that as a background, I think it's very important that we maintain a secure flow of natural gas to our NATO allies. As far as the results of the NATO summit in Brussels in July, there may be a short growth, superficial growth in export demand, perhaps as a demonstration of solidarity with the U.S. or to try and placate the president to get them off their back for not meeting their budgetary requirements. But I think the other part of your question was over time. I think as the LNG infrastructure, global infrastructure develops over time, as you start seeing more competition, as this develops and matures, we'll start to see more of a demand because that's the nature of the supply and demand market. However, that said, I think it will be a challenge to get to that point because there'll be competition from around the world for this LNG, from our partners in Asia and also from China. So I think it has to be price competitive too. So again, they're competing with piped gas from Russia, which quite often LNG is not cost competitive in that regard. So that will be a challenge. However, I think this is important that the U.S. and Qatari exports provide the European allies an option they did not have previous to this, which was the option of trying to break that bond with the Russian gas dominance. And I think that is very important because it gives them a sense of security for their own supply, but also again the ability to renegotiate prices. Example being, 2014, the Klaipėda offshore LNG facility in Lithuania came online, and within a short period of time, they were able to renegotiate what was at that time a fairly high price for Russian gas to a more moderate one. Also, the Polish Sunusi LNG facility came online a couple of years ago. Again, very much a factor in maintaining their energy supply, security, and also, by extension, supporting the U.S. and NATO forces that are housed on their soils. So I guess to come around to answer your question, I think it would be more over time as opposed to any short-term export demand as opposed to gradual demand based on market fundamentals.
Thank you, Arnie. Preston. Energy security is a relatively new component of NATO's calculations, overall calculations. To what degree has this issue of energy security really been appreciated and assimilated by member states? And why do you think the President is deliberately putting the spotlight on the issue now?
Thanks, Paul Michael. I think the reason why now it's more prominent in the news is back this spring, the Baltic states came and met at the White House. So the President had an immediate sit down with heads of state from Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. And then just recently here in mid-May, before President Trump made this announcement about energy as an integral part of security, he met with Secretary General in NATO, Jens Stoltenberg. So this is in preparation for the 11-12 July summit in Brussels. The reason why it came to the fore is that I think a lot of the newer members of NATO in Eastern Europe, they understand how reliant they are on Russian supplies of liquid natural gas and oil. Some of the older members of NATO, it has not become as much of a crisis issue for them as it is for the Eastern European states. Over time, NATO has started to address these issues. They actually have a Center for Energy They're looking at potential conflict or contingency areas, similar to what happened in Crimea and Ukraine, so they could be better prepared for it. But I think they are looking for help. Some of these states don't have a policy like the United States does, where there's a strategic oil reserve. So I think the president wants to interject it into the conversation in July, because there's also going to be a lot of other factors to be addressed, such as member states paying their dues, percentage of their dues required, and then also NATO assistance in Afghanistan with a train and advise mission is going to be high on the president's priority list. But I think for the new part of NATO, it's very much a salient point for the eastern states.
Within that context, then, what do you make of the recent meeting between German Chancellor Merkel and Russian President Vladimir Putin in Sochi? Was this a reaction by Merkel to the president's statement?
I think that President Merkel, she is trying to maintain some kind of tightrope relationship with President Putin. She realizes also Germany's reliance on Russian oil and gas. She may be trying to balance her foreign policy portfolio by staying engaged with President Putin. She is a Russian speaker, understands the culture and the language, and she's trying to maintain some type of balance, because as you see, Germany is really not spending a lot of their money on defense, and right now they're having a huge readiness problem with their military.
Thank you. And now we will proceed to our Over the Horizon 2020 rapid fire segment of forecasts, projections, and prognosis. Each panelist will have 60 to 90 seconds to respond to the questions I'll pose. First question goes to Adam. We are seeing a proliferation of foreign military bases on the Horn of Africa, near the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb, which is the choke point into the Red Sea. Does this indicate a new zone of great power confrontation, especially over oil and gas supplies to Europe and NATO countries?
Thank you. Again, this is I would say this is already a site of regional power competition and gray zone competition in the region, where people are using leverage in other ways to exert influence, especially regional players in the GCC. There are a number of bases being constructed there to take part in, to take more part or divert traffic in terms of and control with the China Belt Road strategy. There's also a lot of players, both regionally and internationally, that would like to expand more in emerging markets in North Africa. So yes, there is a proliferation, and it is a possible area of increased great power competition as Russia moves into the region with basing, as Turkey moves in and upsets some of the balance that was there before with other players, and also between GCC countries. And some of this competition is already having an impact on the ground in terms of internal disputes in Somaliland and elsewhere. So yes, this is a potential and has many of the dynamics similar to right across the Red Sea in Yemen. So there is a potential for competition that is rather destabilizing.
Thank you. Arnie, will the giant Russian-German Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline through the Baltic Sea get built? And if not, why not?
I'll give you a reason why I think it will be built, because I think it's a 60-40 in favor of it being built, just the way the politics have lined up. I think it's a question of being too little too late. Certainly in the case of the United States, where we had elections and were distracted, I think we expected the Europeans to be able to maintain their own security, but that has not been the case. So I think trying to shift sides on this is going to be difficult to intervene on not having it built. I think Putin has been masterful at playing off the internal divisions within the European Union and playing off the weaknesses. So there may be some legislative efforts from Brussels, from the littoral states, which may scuttle this, as we saw back in a couple of years back with South Stream. But I think the big issue here is that Germany is very much in favor of it, extremely much in favor of it, and that with its huge economy and political clout, also with Russia's coercive efforts, they will most likely prevail. Again, I see this as a short-term gain for a long-term negative benefit for the security of Europe, and sacrificed on the altar of environmentalism and Russian relations.
Thank you. Rula. Come 2020, what is your assessment of the nature of Qatari-China relations, both from an energy and security perspective, given some of the changes that we are seeing in a prime market area like Europe for Qatari natural gas?
I think the relationship between the two countries will remain robust. They have had positive bilateral relations that were formally established in 1988, but their trade relationship actually goes back to the 1950s. Qatar is a very geostrategic country to China because of it being located on the One Belt, One Road maritime Silk Route. The financial relationship between the two countries are robust as well. Qatar was the first country in the Middle East to allow for a renminbi clearinghouse to be established just a few years ago. And trade with the Emirate is expected to continue to grow, particularly in areas of infrastructure and engineering. You see a lot of Chinese engineering firms working on the World Cup 2022 projects. And on the infrastructure side, the Chinese managed to complete the Hamad Port project ahead of schedule, in fact, and that has established food security for Qatar, especially at such a vulnerable time. And the financial interests of Qatar are also found in China, where they've invested in a lot of Chinese firms within China.
Very good. Thank you. Tom, Turkey and Russia have just signed a massive agreement on Russian gas imports into Turkey that coincides with Istanbul's desire to acquire Russian S-400 SAMs and possibly the Su-35 counterpart to the United States F-35. Do these moves foreshadow Turkey's departure from its membership in NATO by 2020?
So thank you for the question, Paul Michael. I don't believe so, especially in that short time frame of 2020. I think this is a classic case of Erdogan wanting to balance and walk the line between NATO and the Russians and have the best of both camps. Leaving, while in fact Turkey is constrained in many ways by its NATO membership and U.S. bases, especially the air bases in Turkey, it can be an annoyance when we do operations that they don't feel are in their interest. Conversely, the U.S. and NATO countries are constrained by Turkey's membership. So a few examples. Turkey has the Land Component Command for NATO. This was granted to them as the handshake deal when Rasmussen was made the NATO General Secretary after the cartoon controversy. They would lose that Land Component Command, which gives them a lot of influence. Also, U.S. Relations with the Kurds and U.S. support for the Kurds are constrained by our trying to maintain our relationship with Turkey and Turkey's membership in NATO. Those handcuffs on U.S. and Europe would go away if Turkey, had a break with NATO. There's also a constraint on other countries who are very concerned about Turkey's relationships with the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas. So Israel, Egypt, UAE are currently constrained by Turkey's membership in NATO and by U.S. influence. All of that would come into play.
Thank you. Preston, by 2020, will NATO have a fully articulated energy security policy that it can implement?
Well, Paul Michael, when you say NATO, NATO is a collection of member states. So in order to have consensus to move forward on policy, sometimes it takes quite a bit for NATO to reach consensus. So I think several of the member states may come up with an individual energy policy in regards to energy independence or energy in a wartime or contingency type situation. It takes a while for NATO to move forward. Just recently, they established the North Atlantic Standing Task Force in Norfolk. They want to put it in Norfolk, Virginia, again, like the Cold War. And they're also establishing the Joint Enabling Capabilities Command, which would be more based in Eastern Europe. So that was quite a significant achievement for both of those commands to be put forward. So I think it's low for an overall organization policy.